Hi guys, it's Mrs. Shemko. I know this is really weird for all of us. I've definitely never done anything like this. Giving me a little opportunity to learn some new technology, which is kind of cool. I am right now coming to you from my home. I'm trying to work from home with a 1-year-old and 3-year-old. Not so easy. If you hear them squealing, I apologize for that. Today's assignment, we are going to continue on with the novel study. I considered dropping it and moving on, but I think we're all enjoying this book, so we can continue. You can search online if you want access to it. If you search the Graveyard PDF, you can actually find the whole book online. If you do that, I'm starting from the bottom of page 51 online, which is the middle of chapter 4. And the plan today is I'll read chapter 4 to you guys, and then you have some questions and an assignment to do for chapter 4. So this video will be me finishing reading chapter 4 out loud to you, and then you can get to work. I will be, of course, marking the assignment on Google Classroom and giving you guys feedback, so you can stay tuned to see that as well. Okay. Graveyard book. It's been forever since we've read it. Make sure you read the summaries. I posted some summaries of the previous chapters online. For chapter 4 so far, Bod was in the graveyard. He was in the unconsecrated ground, which we talked about was where the murderers, suicides, the criminals, suicides, and people who didn't belong to the church were buried. So while he was there, he climbed the apple tree and he fell out of the apple tree and hurt his leg, and he met the witch, Liza Hemstock, and Liza helped him out. She was spunky. Bod really liked her and made a new friend, and we left off when he leaves Liza. So we are at the part where where Bod is thinking about how he made his new friend Liza. There were broken lumps of other people's stones and statues in the graveyard, but Bod knew that would have been entirely the wrong sort of thing to bring to the gray-eyed witch in the potter's field. It was going to take more than that. He decided not to tell anyone what he was planning, on the not entirely unreasonable basis that they would have told him not to. Over the next few days, his mind filled with plans, each more complicated and extravagant than the last. Mr. Pennyworth despaired. "I do believe," he announced, scratching his dusty mustache, "that you are getting, if anything, worse. You are not fading. You are obvious, boy. You are difficult to miss. If you came to me in company with a purple lion, a green elephant, and a scarlet unicorn astride, which was a king of England in his royal robes, I do believe that is you, and you alone that people would stare at, dismissing the others as minor irrelevancies." So if you remember, Mr. Pennyworth is one of Bod's teachers, and he's trying to teach him to fade. And in a fantastic description from the author, he talks about how Bod is not learning to fade at all. Bod simply stared at him and said nothing. He was wondering whether there were special shops in the places where the living people gathered that sold only headstones, and if so, how he could go about finding one, and fading was the least of his problems. So his friend the witch, Liza, didn't have a headstone, and she was really upset about that, so Bod is trying to figure out how to buy her one. But Bod has no money and no way to buy her one, so that is his problem right now. He took advantage of Miss Borrow's willingness to be diverted from subjects of grammar and composition to the subject of anything else at all to ask her about money, how exactly it worked, how one used it to get things one wanted. Bod had a number of coins he had found over the years. He had learned that the best place to find money was to go, afterwards, to wherever courting couples had used the grass of the graveyard as a place to cuddle and snuggle and kiss and roll about. He would often find metal coins on the ground in the place where they had been, and he thought he could perhaps finally get some use from them. "How much would a headstone be?" he asked Miss Burrows. "In my time," she told them, "they were 15 guineas. I do not know what they would be today. More, I imagine, much, much more." Bod had found 2 pounds and 53 pence. So you notice he talks about pounds and pence because they're in England, right? So it's a different money than we have here. It would, he was quite certain, not be enough. It had been 4 years, almost half a lifetime since Bod had visited the Indigo Man's tomb, but he still remembered the way. So if you remember when he visited the Indigo tomb with Scarlet, I think they said he was around 5. So now he's around 9, I assume. He climbed on top of the hill until he was above the whole town, above even the top of the apple tree, above even the steeple of the little chapel, up where the Frobisher mausoleum stood like a rotten tooth. He slipped down into it, behind the coffin, and down, and still further down to the tiny stone steps cut into the center of the hill, and those he descended until he reached the stone chamber. It was dark in that tomb, dark as a tin mine, but Bod saw as the dead see, and the room gave up its secrets to him. So at this point, you should be thinking, what is Bod doing in the Indigo Man's tomb again? It didn't go great for him before, but now he needs money. So think about what he's looking for in that tomb. The sleer was coiled around the wall of the barrow. He could feel it. It was as if he remembered it, an invisible thing, all smoky tendrils and hate and greed. This time, however, he was not afraid of it. "Fear us," whispered the sleer, "for we guard things precious and never lost." "I don't fear you," said Bod. "Remember? And I need to take something away from here." "Nothing ever leaves," came the reply from the coiled thing in the darkness. "The knife, the brooch, the goblet. The sleer guards them in the darkness. We wait." "Pardon me for asking," said Bod, "but was this your grave?" "Master sets us here on a plan to guard, buries our skulls beneath this stone, leaves us here knowing what we have to do. We guard the treasures until Master comes back." "I expect that he's all but forgotten about you," pointed out Bod. "I'm sure he's been dead himself for ages." "We are the sleer. We guard." Bod wondered just how long you had to go back before the deepest tomb inside the hill was on a plain, and he knew it must have been an extremely long time ago. He could feel the sleer winding its waves of fear around him, like the tendrils of a carnivus plant. He was beginning to feel cold and slow, as if he had been bitten in the heart by some Arctic viper. A great simile there. And it was starting to pump its icy venom through his blood. He took a step forward, so he was standing against a stone slab, and he reached down and closed his fingers around the coldness of the brooch. "Hish," whispered the sleer. "We guard that for the Master." "He won't mind," said Bod. He took a step backwards, walking toward the stone steps, avoiding the desiccated remains of people and animals on the floor. The sleer writhed angrily, twining around the tiny chamber like ghost smoke. Then it slowed. "It comes back," said the sleer in its tangled triple voice. "Always comes back." Bod went up the stone steps inside the hill as fast as he could. At one point, he imagined that there was something coming after him, but when he broke out of the top into the Frobisher mausoleum and he could breathe the cool dawn air, nothing moved or followed. Bod sat in the open air of the top of the hill and held the brooch. He thought it was all black at first, but then the sun rose and he could see the stone in the center of the black metal was a swirling red. It was the size of a robin's egg, and Bod stared into the stone, wondering if there was things moving in its heart, his eyes and soul deep in the crimson world. If Bod had been smaller, he would have wanted to put it in his mouth. The stone was held in place by a black metal clasp by something that looked like claws, with something else crawling around it. The something else looked almost snake-like, but it had too many heads. Bod wondered if that was what the sleer looked like in the daylight. That's interesting. I hope you could picture that in your head as I was reading. He wandered down the hill, taking all the shortcuts he knew through the ivy tangle that covered the Bartleby family vault, and inside the sound of the Bartlebys grumbling and readying for sleep, and on and over and through the railings and into the potter's field. He called, "Liza, Liza," and looked around. "Good morrow, young lummox," said Liza's voice. Bod could not see her, but there was an extra shadow beneath the hawthorn tree, and as he approached it, the shadow resolved itself into something pearlescent and translucent in the early morning light, something girl-like, something gray-eyed. I'm always curious about the powers that these creatures in the graveyard have, and we know that she's a witch, so what kind of powers does this witch have? "I should be decently sleeping," she said. "What kind of carrying on is this?" "Your headstone," he said. "I wanted to know what you want on it." My name, she said. It must have my name on it, with a big E for Elizabeth, like the old queen that died when I was born, and a big H for Hemstock. More than I care not, for I never did master my letters. What about dates? Said Bod. William the Conqueror, 1066, she sang in the whisper of the dawn wind in the hawthorn tree. A big E, if you please, and a big H. Did you have a job? Asked Bod. I mean, when you weren't being a witch. I'd done laundry, said the dead girl, and then the morning sunlight flooded the wasteland, and Bod was alone. It was 9 in the morning when all the world is sleeping. I wish I could sleep at 9 in the morning. Bod was determined to stay awake. He was, after all, on a mission. He was 8 years old, so I was a year off, and the world beyond the graveyard held no terrors for him. Clothes. He would need clothes. His usual dress of a gray winding sheet was, he knew, quite wrong. It was good in the graveyard, the same color as the stone and shadows. But if he was going to dare the world beyond the graveyard walls, he would need to blend in there. So Bod plans to leave the graveyard. He plans to go try buy a headstone with his brooch. There were some clothes in the crypt beneath the ruined church, but Bod did not want to go down to the crypt, not even in the daylight. While Bod was prepared to justify himself to Master and Mistress Owens, he was not about to explain himself to Silas. The very thought of those dark, angry eyes, or worse still, disappointed eyes, filled him with shame. Bod is not allowed to leave the graveyard. It's not safe for him because the man Jack is still looking for him, so he's leaving without permission. There was a gardener's hut at the far end of the graveyard, a small green building that smelled like motor oil, and in which the old mower sat and rusted, unused, along with the assortment of ancient garden tools. The hut had been abandoned when the last gardener had retired, before Bod was born, and the task of keeping the graveyard had been shared between the council, who sent in a man to cut the grass and clean the paths once a month from April to September, and the local volunteers in the front of the graveyard. A huge padlock on the door protected the contents of the hut, but Bod had long ago discovered the loose wooden board in the back. Sometimes he would go to the gardener's hut and sit and think when he wanted to be by himself. As long as he had been going to the hut, there had been a brown working man's jacket hanging on the back of the door, forgotten or abandoned years ago, along with a green-stained pair of gardening jeans. The jeans were much too big for him, but he rolled up the cuffs until his feet showed, and then he made a belt out of the brown garden twine and tied it around his waist. There were boots in one corner, and he tried putting them on, but they were so big and encrusted with mud and concrete that he could barely shuffle in them, and if he took a step, the boots remained on the floor of the shed. He pushed the jacket out through the space in the loose board, squeezed himself out, then put it on. If he rolled up the sleeves, he decided, it worked quite well. It had big pockets, and he thrust his hands down into them, and he felt quite the dandy. So again, if you can picture what Bod looks like and would look like to people that he's going to see, this 8-year-old boy in giant gardening clothes. Bod walked down to the main gate of the graveyard and looked out through the bars. A bus rattled past in the street. There were cars there and noise and shops. Behind him, a cool green shade overgrown with trees and ivy. Home. His heart pounding, Bod walked out into the world. There's a lot of character development in this chapter. I want you to think about what the author is revealing about Bod's personality in this chapter. Think of the actions that Bod took, his interactions with Liza, the fact that he really wants to get her a tombstone, and now the fact that he is going out into the world. Like, that is pretty brave of him to do, very courageous for an 8-year-old boy to want to do. Ebenezer Bolger had seen some odd types in his time. If you owned a shop like Ebenezer's, you'd see them too. The shop in the warren of streets in the old town, a little bit antique shops, a little bit junk shop, a little bit pawnbrokers, and not even Ebenezer himself was entirely certain which bit was which, brought odd types and strange people, some of them wanting to buy, some of them needing to sell. Ebenezer Bolger traded over the counter, buying and selling, and he did a better trade behind the counter and in the back room, accepting objects that might not have been inquired entirely honestly, and then quietly shifting them on. So you can probably see what's going to happen here, right? He owns a pawn shop. He buys things, not always honestly, right? This Ebenezer will buy things that have been stolen or acquired illegally, and then he'll turn around and sell them. His business was an iceberg. That's a metaphor, right? Saying that his business was a metaphor, or his business was an iceberg, comparing the business and the iceberg without saying like or as. Only the dusty little shop was visible on the surface. The rest of it was underneath, and that's just how Ebenezer Bulger wanted it. Ebenezer Bulger had thick spectacles and a permanent expression of mild distaste, as if he had just realized that the milk in his tea had been on the turn, and he could not get the sour taste of it out of his mouth. The expression served him well when people tried to sell him things. Honestly, he would tell them, sour-faced, it's not really worth anything at all. I'll give you what I can, though, as it has sentimental value. You were lucky to get anything like what you wanted from Ebenezer Bulger. A business like Ebenezer Bulger's brought in strange people, but the boy who came in that morning was one of the strangest Ebenezer could remember in a lifetime of cheating strange people out of their valuables. He looked to be about 7 years old and dressed in his grandfather's clothes. He smelled like a shed. His hair was long and shaggy, and he seemed extremely grave. His hands were deep in the pockets of his dusty brown jacket, but even with the hands out of sight, Ebenezer could see that something was clutched extremely tightly, protectively in the boy's right hand. "Excuse me," said the boy. "Aye, aye, Sonny Jim," said Ebenezer Bulger warily. Kids, he thought. Either they're nicked something or they're trying to sell their toys. Either way, he usually said no. Buy stolen property from a kid, and next thing you know, you'd have an enraged adult accusing you of having given little Johnny or Matilda a tenner for their wedding ring. More trouble than they were worth, kids. "I need something for a friend of mine," said the boy, "and I thought maybe you could buy something I've got." "I don't buy stuff from kids," said Ebenezer Bulger flatly. Bod took out his hand out of his pocket and put the brooch down on the grimy countertop. Bulger glanced down at it, then looked at it. He removed his spectacles. He took an eyepiece from the countertop and screwed it into his eye. He turned on a little light in the counter and examined the brooch through the eyeglass. "Snakestone?" he said, to himself, not to the boy. Then he took the eyepiece out, replaced his glasses, and fixed the boy with a sour and suspicious look. "Where did you get this?" Ebenezer Bulger asked. Bod said, "Do you want to buy it?" "You stole it. You've nicked it from a museum or somewhere, haven't you?" "No," said Bod flatly. "Are you going to buy it, or shall I go and find someone who will?" Ebenezer Bulger's sour mood changed then. Suddenly, he was all affability. He smiled broadly. "I'm sorry," he said. "I just don't see many pieces like this. Not in a shop like this, not outside of a museum. But I certainly would like it. Tell you what, why don't we sit down over tea and biscuits? I've got a couple packets of chocolate chip cookies in the back room, and decide how much this is worth, eh?" Bod was relieved that the man was finally being friendly. "I need enough to buy a stone," he said, "a headstone for a friend of mine. Well, she's not really a friend, just someone I know. I think she helped make my leg better, you see?" Ebenezer Bulger, paying attention to the boy's prattle, led him behind the counter and opened the door to the storeroom, a windowless little space, every inch of which was crammed high with teetering cardboard boxes, each filled with junk. There was a safe in there in a corner, a big old one. There was a box filled with violins, an accumulation of stuffed dead animals, chairs without seats, books, and prints. There was a small desk behind the door, and Ebenezer Bulger pulled up the only chair and sat down, letting Bod stand. Ebenezer rummaged in a drawer in which Bod could see a half-empty bottle of whiskey and pulled out an almost finished packet of chocolate chip cookies and offered one to the boy. He turned on the desk light, looked at the brooch again, the swirls of red and orange in the stone, and he examined the black metal band that encircled it, suppressing a little shiver at the expression on the heads of the snake things. "This is old," he said. "It's priceless," he thought. "Probably not really worth much, but you never know." Bod's face fell. Ebenezer Bulger tried to look reassuring. "I just need to know that it's not stolen, though, before I can give you a penny. Did you take it from your mom's dresser? Nick it from a museum? You can tell me. I'll not get you into trouble. I just need to know." Bod shook his head. He munched on his cookie. "Then where did you get it?" Bod said nothing. Ebenezer Bulger did not want to put down the brooch, but he pushed it back across the desk to the boy. If you can't tell me, he said, you'd better take it back. There has to be trust on both sides after all. Nice doing business with you. Sorry it couldn't go any further. Bod looked worried. Then he said, I found it in an old grave, but I can't say where. He stopped because naked greed and excitement had replaced the friendliness on Ebenezer Bulger's face. There's more like it there? Bod said, if you don't want to buy it, I'll find someone else. Thank you for the biscuit. Bulger said, you're in a hurry, eh? Mom and Dad waiting for you, I expect. The boy shook his head, then wished he nodded. Nobody waiting? Good. Ebenezer Bulger closed his hand around the brooch. Now, you tell me exactly where you found this, eh? I don't remember, said Bod. Finally, Bod's doing something smart here. He's obviously pretty naive, too trusting, so he's finally getting a sense that he should not trust Ebenezer. Too late for that, said Ebenezer. Suppose you have a little thing for a bit about where it came from. Then when you've thought, we'll have a little chat and you'll tell me. He got up, walked out of the room, and closed the door behind him. He locked it with a large metal key. He opened his hand and looked at the brooch and smiled hungrily. There was a ding from the bell above the shop door to let him know someone had entered, and he looked up guiltily. But there was no one there. The door was slightly ajar, though, and Bulger pushed it shut, and then for good measure he turned around the sign in the window so it said close. He pushed the bolt shut. Didn't want any busybodies turning up today. Okay, so Ebenezer heard the door open, but nobody was there. So who do you think is in that shop with him? The autumn day had turned from sunny to gray, and a light patter of rain ran down the grubby shop window. Ebenezer Bulger picked up the telephone from the counter and pushed at the buttons with fingers that barely shook. Pay dirt, Tom, he said. Get over here, soon as you can. Bod realized he was trapped when he heard the lock turn in the door. He pulled on the door, but it held fast. He felt stupid for having been lured inside, foolish for not trusting his first impulses to get as far away from the sour-faced man as possible. He had broken all of the rules of the graveyard, and everything had gone wrong. What would Silas say, or the Owenses? He could feel himself begin to panic, and he suppressed it, pushing the worry back down inside him. It would all be good. He knew that. Of course, he needed to get out. He examined the room he was trapped in. It was little more than a storeroom with a desk in it. The only entrance was the door. He opened the desk drawer, finding nothing but small pots of paint used for brightening up antiques and a paintbrush. He wondered if he would be able to throw paint in the man's face and blind him for long enough to escape. He opened the top of the pot of paint and dipped it in his finger. What are you doing? Asked a voice close to his ear. Nothing, said Bod, screwing the top of the paint pot and dropping it into the jacket's enormous pockets. Who do you think's talking to him? Liza Hemstock looked at him unimpressed. Why are you in here? She asked. And what's that old bag of lard out there? It's his shop. I was trying to sell him something. Why? None of your beeswax, she sniffed. Well, she said, you should get on back to the graveyard. I can't. He's locked me in. Of course you can. Just slip through the wall. He shook his head. I can't. I can only do it at home because they gave me freedom of the graveyard when I was a baby. He looked up at her under the electric light. It was hard to see her properly, but Bod had spent his life talking to dead people. Anyway, what are you doing here? What are you doing at the graveyard? It's daytime, and you're not like Silas. You're meant to stay in the graveyard. She said, there's rules for those in graveyards, but not for those as we buried in unhallowed ground. Nobody tells me what to do or where to go. She glared at the door. I don't like that man, she said. I'm going to see what he's doing. A flicker, and Bod was alone in the room once more. He heard a rumble of distant thunder. In the cluttered darkness of Bulger's antiques, Ebenezer Bulger looked up suspiciously, certain that someone was watching him. Then he realized he was being foolish. The boy's locked in that room, he told himself. The front door's locked. He was polishing the metal clasps surrounding the snake stone as gently and as carefully as an archaeologist on a dig, taking off the black and revealing the glittering silver beneath it. He was beginning to regret calling Tom Hustings over, although Hustings was big and good for scaring people. He was also beginning to regret that he was going to have to sell the brooch when he was done. It was special. The more it glittered under the tiny light on the counter, the more he wanted it to be his and only his. There was more where this came from, though. The boy would tell him. The boy would lead him to it. An idea struck him. He put down the brooch reluctantly and opened a drawer behind the counter, taking out a metal biscuit tin filled with envelopes and cards and slips of paper. He reached in and took out a card only slightly larger than a business card. It was black-edged. There was no name or address printed on it, though. Only one word, handwritten in the center in an ink that had faded to brown. Whose business card do you think he has here? Jack. On the back of the card in pencil, Ebenezer Bulger had written instructions to himself in his tiny, precise handwriting as a reminder, although he would have been unlikely to forget the use of the card, how to use it to summon the man Jack. No, not summon, invite. You did not summon people like him. And knocking on the outer door of the shop, Bulger tossed the card down onto the counter and walked over to the door, peering out into the wet afternoon. "Hurry up," called Tom Hustings. "It's miserable out here. Dismal. I'm getting soaked." Bulger unlocked the door and Tom Hustings pushed his way in, his raincoat and hair dripping. "What's so important that you can't talk about it over the phone, huh?" "Our fortune," said Ebenezer Bulger with his sour face. "That's what." We're going to leave it here. We're not quite done chapter 4. Tom has been called because he's big and scary, and he is supposed to convince Bod to tell them where he got the brooch so that they can find more. So the questions are posted and the assignment is posted. I hope you enjoyed this so far, and we will be in touch again. Thanks, guys. Bye.